Hello, welcome once more to my course on literary theory. Today we shall explore the written and oral traditions. We will look at the structural analysis of fairy tales through the figure of Vladimir Prop, and we will also begin to explore myths as cultural artifacts through the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss. So let us begin. In the course of human history, knowledge has been preserved in different ways, making up our cultural heritage. Some of the first documents of human history were cave paintings and inscriptions on bones and stones. Millions of years afterwards, signs and images began to appear. Support materials have ranged from rocks to tools, vessels, weapons, cuneiform tablets, papyrus rolls, codices, and nowadays electronic materials. Preservation of knowledge has been linked to the invention of different kinds of materials for writing, painting, making music, and so on. Human creativity and imagination has always played an important role in this process of knowledge preservation. Human memory is undoubtedly proactive, that is, future oriented and imaginative, a quality praised in the arts but also acquired in recognition with scientific discovery and empirical reason. One of the most fundamental discoveries in the history of humankind was that of language preservation, or writing. Language is the very substance of knowledge, and the invention of signs and letters became the primary communication media. Language is also the main medium for memorizing cultural processes. Written literature has therefore had an important role in shaping cultural canons, ranging from habits to conducts, and also political institutions and even nations. As many other aspects of our world, both oral and written language constitute themselves following analogic principles. Texts are pieces of information, phonemes, morphemes, words that are chained and knitted together. These pieces connect by means of certain rules agreed upon by the community of speakers. The act of composing a text may be therefore described as writing, whereas the act of interpreting the text is reading. The different materials used for writing tend to follow this textuality, which forms the basis of our own memory patterns. Thus, papyrus, the earliest form of paper used by the Egyptians as far back as the first dynasty, that is 2600 years before Common Era, was made from the pith of the wetland plant, whose stems were cut lengthwise, flattened and overlapped side by side on two layers, the second one perpendicular to the first, so that all the horizontal fibers parallel with the roll length were on the side and all the vertical fibers were on the other. Papyrus became an important reading commodity in the Mediterranean region, exchanged among all the territories and colonies of ancient Greece. Novel techniques for papyrus were developed around the first century in Pergamon, one of the main cities in Asia Minor at the time. Today is Bergama in Turkey. The great library there rivaled the famous one in Alexandria. Parchment had also been used in some Egyptian texts of the fourth dynasty, and even in the Assyrian and Babylonian cultures, which used to impress their cuneiform writing on clay tablets. But also parchment was sometimes used. For example, in the Babylonian Talmud, Moses writes the first Torah scroll on a split cow hide. Rabbinic and early Islamic texts were also found on parchment, which was more resilient than papyrus to humid conditions. In Greece, texts were written on the recto, that is, the lines following the fibers, right-hand side page. But papyrus were sometimes reused, writing across the fibers of the verso, or left-hand page, of the folded sheet. and sometimes they were scrubbed to form palimpsests. That meant that the earlier text was lost. The term palimpsest in Greek means scraped again. Around the 4th century before Common Era, a special type of notebook was introduced, serving as a memoranda and later for public purposes. As Plato indicates in the Phaedo, the technology of the hypomnemata constituted a material memory of oral speech, contributing to form the raw materials for later writing. In Northern Europe, the earliest examples of runic writing, the term rune means secret, were found on rocks and wood, the oldest being that of a comb found in a bog in Bimots in Denmark, and dating from around 160 Christian era. Runes were also found on weapons such as longbows, arrowheads, and also on ornaments, giving name to the craftsman who made them and sometimes to the owner. However, mostly they are believed to be signs used for charms and divination. In the Western world, Christianization gradually replaced the runic alphabet with the Latin one, which evolved from Phoenician and Etruscan alphabets. As mentioned, in areas where papyrus was unavailable, parchment prepared from animal skins was used. The Codex Runicus, written around 1300 Common Era and containing a number of Danish laws, is one of the few runic texts found on parchment. While other religions preferred the roll, the early Christian writers employed codex made of papyrus, more compact and better suited for people on the move. Sheets of parchment were also used folded to form codices until the more inexpensive paper was introduced in Europe by way of the Muslims, who had a paper mill in operation in Baghdad as early as the year 794. It was later manufactured in Moorish Spain. Varied writing materials were used before the invention of paper in ancient China in the 1st century Common Era. For example, different types of wood and bamboo staves were often inscribed. The ancient codices of pre-Columbian America, Maya and Aztec cultures, were also made of long folded strips of paper made of wood, bark, or plant fiber with a layer of whitewash. Documents of importance were inscribed on soft, metallic sheets, such as copper plate, because leaves and paper were not as durable in hot, humid climates. Buddhist manuscripts were inscribed on brass, copper, or ivory sheets. Some important Etruscan texts were similarly inscribed on thin gold plates. The Romans used wax-coated tablets that could be reused. Codex made of wood for taking notes and other informal writings were also used. However, parchment, roll, or scroll made the dominant medium for literary works. The codex was an improvement over the scroll because it took less storage space, it was easier to transport, and allowed sequential access and easier reading. Pages could also be written on both sides, and its stable spine on which the title of the book could be written made easier the task of organizing documents in a library. Manuscript codices were often enriched with border decoration, engrossed initial letters, and illustrations. The best known examples of these are the Celtic Book of Kells and the Northumbrian Lindisfarne Gospels from late 7th century, which combine Anglo-Saxon and Celtic themes. Now we will continue talking about the oral tradition and the different types of oral tradition until we reach the main topic of our lecture today, which is myths. Because prose is the ordinary form of human discourse, used to communicate knowledge and other forms of cultural material, there are many forms of prose. For instance, we can mention history, essays, fiction, science, philosophy, epistolary correspondence, etc. These different classes are subject also to numerous subdivisions. Alongside the written forms of prose, we have the oral tradition, which is preserved and transmitted orally from generation to generation. The oral tradition also includes various forms, from speech and oratory, political, educational, etc., to legends, fairy tales, and myths. History is the systematic record of past events. It rests upon testimony and memory and existed first in the form of the oral tradition, gradually also in the written form. In the ancient traditions, history treated legendary heroes as descendants of divinities, and the border between the real and imaginary events was not very clear. Thus, myths can be considered early forms of oral versions of history. A genre is a term that translates from the French to mean kind or type. These types differ from the actions in their plots to the emotions they elicit from the audience. The classic division of genres dating to Aristotle includes poetry, drama, and prose. Poetry may then be subdivided into the genres of lyric, epic, and dramatic. The lyric includes all the shorter forms of poetry: song, ode, ballad, elegy, sonnet. Dramatic poetry might include comedy, tragedy, melodrama, and mixtures like tragicomedy. Prose, on the other hand, encompasses more variations, including the oral and the written traditions. The oral tradition is also particularly related to folklore. Folklore is a term coming from the Germanic tradition and meaning folk, people, and law, instruction. It's the expressive body of culture shared by a particular group of people and encompasses the traditions common to that culture, subculture, and group. These include oral traditions such as fables, tales, proverbs, etc. In Europe, folklore began to distinguish itself as an autonomous discipline during the so-called Romantic period, and in particular through the German philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder and the Grimm brothers. Storytellers traditionally held a high place of honor in society. The duties of ancient oral storytellers included being advisors, court singers, poets, tribal historians, genealogists, teachers, composers, critics, travelers, and reporters. Folk tales often followed the rule of three, where part of the story is repeated 3 times with minor variations. The first 2 instances build tension, and the third releases it by incorporating a twist. This made the story easier to remember. Legends are records of important events and of people's actions, sometimes exaggerated to fulfill a given purpose, for example, to sustain power or to entertain. They describe exceptional people doing exceptional things that serve as moral guides to proper action in the community. They may have a historical basis and include some verifiable evidence or facts. However, legends mostly exaggerate elements of a real hero, for example, Beowulf, Ramayana, Robin Hood, or King Arthur. Finally, fairy tales connect with the supernatural world and become very popular in the Romantic period with the emphasis on the recovery of the folk tradition. Please explore my separate video lecture that focuses on fairy stories as they impact poetry and painting in the Romantic and Victorian periods. Among the scholars performing critical analysis of the oral tradition, Vladimir Prop occupies an important position. Prop explored a set of 100 stories of traditional Russian fairy tales and folk tales in order to find a basic structure underlying all of them. Prop found that the tales conform to a schema of 31 functions and that the sequential progression of functions was always the same, in spite of the superficial differences between the stories. To demonstrate this structure, Prop devised two categories, actors and functions. Actors are the types of central characters who appear in the tales. These include the hero, the villain, the seeker, the helper, the false helper, the princess, etc. Functions are the acts or events which carry the narrative forward. And Prop found 31 functions which always appear in the same sequence, although not all of them appear in every story. Some common functions are the final 7. 25. A difficult task is proposed to the hero. 26. The task is resolved. 27. The hero is recognized. 28. The false hero or villain is exposed. 29. The false hero is given a new appearance. 30. The villain is punished. 31. The hero is married or ascends to the throne. Proper structure can be found in many different kinds of literary narratives, not just fairy tales. For example, they appear in most epics, romances, and also in myths. Finally, fables are another type of folk stories which seek to instruct. The term comes from Latin fabula, meaning story or tale. The structure is dialogical and the protagonists are animal, plants, and sometimes forces of nature that acquire human characteristics and teach a moral lesson. The basis is the idea of the superiority of knowledge coming from nature. Some well-known examples from the classical period are the fables collected by Aesop, Avianus, or Fabio Macrobius. Among modern fables, George Orwell's Animal Farm. In some fables, we can also find the figure of the trickster in animal form. Its most important ability is its wit and cunning. It's often a prankster, a joker, who serves to teach a lesson to its opponent. Sometimes the trickster is tricked and appears as the fool. The trickster fool is also one of the Jungian archetypes. One example of trickster fables are the coyote narratives of Latin American tradition and the story of Brother Rabbit. The term myth comes from Greek mythos, meaning word of mouth or tale, and they are master stories whose purpose is to explain the world, the origin of life on earth, of natural events, record the life in community before the historical memory records, and so on. They often speak of important cosmological events with or without a determinable basis of fact or natural explanation. Deities or demigods, sometimes heroes, appear in relation to natural phenomena and show the first instances of the use of technological weapons. A hero is a mythological figure who changes the world through invention or discovery. They are credited with discovering fire, agriculture, arts, being exemplary religious figures, etc. Mythological heroes are often responsible for cultural shifts, often by means of a new technology or scientific advance. Heroes were often associated to constellations and stars, particularly particular mythological animals, rulers, and so on. Mythical events are interpreted as symbolic, not factual, and events are narrated, generally found in all cultures around the world. For example, we find myths of creation, myths of destruction, such as the Great Flood, myths of community building, and myths of mediation. We have mediators like, for example, Prometheus, or the great Maya and Aztec feathered serpent. As we shall see, Carl Jung believed that myths were the symbolic projection of the people's hopes, values, fears, and aspirations, and which appear in the form of patterns which he termed archetypes. Myth criticism designates the convergence of several methods and forms of inquiry about the complex relations between literature and myth, thus connecting various disciplines and interdisciplinary issues. Some questions that arise immediately are, for example, if all myths have narrative forms, or if some may be condensed in just an image, which of course can be told and narrated. Finally, we can also question if all literature encompasses mythical forms, even if they may evolve historically, and in this case, if all literature is susceptible to myth criticism. Many mythical narratives take the form of allegories. In The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays, Albert Camus wrote about the duplicity of myth lessons, affirming that from Pandora's box, where all the ills of humanity swarm, the Greeks drew out hope after all the others, as the most dreadful of all. I know no more stirring symbol, for contrary to the general belief, hope equals resignation, and to live is not to resign ourselves. Prussian philosopher Ernst Cassirer wrote a monumental study on the philosophy of symbolic forms in 1925, where he insisted that myths are fundamental symbolic forms that are typically imaginistic and emotion-laden. Cassirer noted the intrinsic and ambiguous relation between myth and religion, affirming that we think of religion as the symbolic expression of our highest moral ideals. We think of magic as a crude aggregate of superstitions. Religious belief seems to become more superstitious credulity if we admit any relationship with magic. On the other hand, our anthropological and ethnographical material makes it extremely difficult to separate the two fields. For Cassirer, there is no reflective separation of the real and the ideal. The mythic image does not represent the thing, it is the thing. Thus, it taps into the inner recesses of the mind, what Sigmund Freud termed primary process thinking. This means that myths are not conscious forms of representation as history, traditional architecture, etc. Like the most innovative artistic forms, myths are closer to the emotional mind and capture the dynamics of life feeling. And this is a quote from Cassirer. For example, in her book Paradise Lost as Myth from 1959, Isabel McCaffrey insists that the rendering of the Christian myth of Satan, which is at the center of Milton's epic, is not merely a representation, but, and I quote, the direct rendering of certain stupendous realities now known only indirectly in the symbolic signatures of earthly life, end of quote. McCaffrey insists that in this sense the poem is not allegorical but mythic material, connects directly to the symbolic idea in Platonic terms. This explanation is akin to the one provided in 1919 by the Swiss psychiatrist and one-time disciple of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung. In Jung's view, myths are emotional forms of extrasensorial perception that link directly to the divine realm. From another perspective, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, whose extensive work with South American tribal societies yielded extraordinary analysis, argues that the meaning of myths lies not in their manifest content, but rather in their underlying structure of relations. He proposed that the proper study for anthropologists is to categorize the underlying patterns of human thought that produce general and universal categories. Thus, he conducted cross-cultural analysis of kinship, myths, and religion in an attempt to understand the fundamental structure of human cognition. Inspired by his professor Marcel Mauss, he tried to demonstrate that exchange in primitive societies was not motivated by economic motives, but instead by rules of reciprocity upon which the solidarity of the society depended. All of culture is manifest in human exchanges of three categories of commodities. According to Claude Lévi-Strauss, these include goods, such as dried fish, figurines, etc., messages, news, confirmation of status, and so on, and persons, kinship, marriage systems, etc. All human thought is bricolage, that is, appropriating objects from one context and putting them to use in another. For instance, in ancient societies, women were a commodity that could be exchanged, and kinship systems were about the exchange of women by defining the categories of potential spouses and prohibited mates. According to Lévi-Strauss, this naturally binary distinction led to the formation of the incest taboo, with the invention of exogamy. Before that, men mated female family members. Culture, like language, is essentially a collection of arbitrary symbols that relate to each other and form a system. Studying the patterns of the system can help unveil conscious and unconscious principles. In this way, Lévi-Strauss believes that the underlying logical processes that structure all human thought operate within diverse cultural contexts. Consequently, cultural phenomena are not identical, but they are the products of an underlying universal pattern of thought. Culture is inherently an intellectual achievement, a form of reasoning, and Lévi-Strauss terms it a form of bricolage, and he explains that humans appropriate aspects of nature and turn them to human-defined ends. And he uses the expression, they cook the raw materials of nature, organizing them into structures of ever-increasing complexity, using simple binary oppositions layered ones upon another. Lévi-Strauss focuses on the relations between linguistic terms that express cognitive structures and which appear in the form of binary oppositions, mediating between polar streams, such as raw cooked, agricultural welfare, upstream downstream, sky earth, dark light, or life and death. Applying Saussure's theories on language to the study of myth, Lévi-Strauss concluded that there is a kind of narrative grammar inherent in the human mind and present in myths. He terms these structures mythemes and explains that they are part of a collective human consciousness. The task of the structural analysis is to break the myth into its constituent elements, mythemes, and uncover the unconscious meaning found in the binary relationship between them. Uncovering this hidden structural core will reveal, according to Lévi-Strauss, the essential elements of human thought. The following are a couple of quotations from The Savage Mind, one of Lévi-Strauss' books. The unconscious activity of the mind consists in imposing forms upon content, and if these forms are fundamentally the same for all minds, ancient and modern, primitive and civilized, it is necessary and sufficient to grasp the unconscious structure underlying each institution's and custom. The second quotation: in any society, communication operates on three different levels: communication of women, communication of goods and services, communication of messages. Therefore, kinship studies, economics, and linguistics approach the same kinds of problems in different strategic levels and really pertain to the same field. Levi-Strauss identifies four levels of representation within myth: geographic, techno-economic, sociological, and cosmological. Myths describe locations, rivers, places, also historical memory, for example, famines, residence patterns, relations between families and kin. And these descriptions are not distorted reflections of reality, but a multi-layer model of structural relationships. On the geographical level, for example, there is the basic opposition between East and West, while on the cosmological level, there are oppositions of heaven and the subterranean world, as you can see there in your image on the screen. And this is, of course, something that is culturally based, but also physically based. So finally, Levi-Strauss proposes that there are two aspects in the construction of myth: the sequence of events which form the apparent content of what happened, the schemata of myth which represent the different planes of abstraction on which the sequence is organized.